Support for NPR and the following message come from Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. Claim your $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/NPR. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luce, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident. So I'm going to start off by saying something very uncontroversial. The New York City mayoral race has become a national story. I know you think I'm biased because I'm literally sitting in my apartment in New York City while I say this. I get on the subway and bam, there's Democratic nominee Zohran Mamdani on a campaign ad. Geolocation aside, I know it's a national story because politicians from all across the country are, we'll say, weighing in on Mamdani's recent primary win. And here's where things start to get controversial. After Mamdani's win, Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene reposted an image of the Statue of Liberty covered in a burqa. South Carolina Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace posted an image of Mamdani in a kurta and said, "After 9/11, we said never forget. I think sadly we have forgotten." End quote. Texas Republican Congressman Brandon Gill commented on a video of Mamdani eating rice with his hands and said, quote, "Civilized people in America don't eat like this. If you refuse to adopt Western customs, go back to the third world." End quote. And Democrats, too. New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand falsely stated that Mamdani referenced global jihad. That is not true. Gillibrand later apologized. And a super PAC backing Democrat Andrew Cuomo in the primary prepared a mailer that appeared to lengthen and darken Mamdani's beard. So what do these Republicans and Democrats have in common? Well, here's how Tazeen Ali sees it.
All of the examples that you just referenced are textbook Islamophobia on both sides of the political spectrum.
Tazeen is a professor of religion and politics at Washington University, St. Louis.
The comment about seeing it both on the left and the right, I think, is a testament to just how malleable political Islamophobia is, in the sense that it's a very quick and accessible way to signal loyalty to the U.S.
So basically, she's saying Islamophobia works for both parties. And at the core, they're making a judgment about what makes an American Muslim, quote unquote, good or bad. And this is where it gets very personal for Mamdani.
It was Mamdani's father, Mahmoud, a revered professor and anthropologist at Columbia University, who years ago wrote a book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim.
That is Nathan Lean. He's a professor of religious studies at North Carolina State University.
And in that book, he criticized this dichotomy where good Muslims are said to behave and look and dress and act in a certain way, and that is almost always in accordance with Western liberal political and cultural expectations. And then bad Muslims, as it goes, represent the opposite of these so-called good Muslims.
So thinking about Mamdani eating rice with his hands or voicing support for Gaza, his culture and politics here, in the eyes of his political opponents, make him a, quote, bad Muslim.
And of course, the problem with that, if it's not obvious, is that whether one is a good Muslim or a bad Muslim, as if those are real categories to begin with, depends only on the political ideology of the person or the group making that judgment. And so here, specifically to Mamdani's case, by not condemning, for example, the phrase globalize the Intifada, the right and its white nationalist supporters on social media are casting him as a bad Muslim, right? Because he refuses to subject himself to their particular measure of how he must behave and what he must think and how he must act.
And phrases like globalize the Intifada have become divisive, with some viewing it as an expression of international solidarity for Palestinian human rights, and others viewing it as a call to violence against Israel.
I should note that this is not something that's uncommon. This happened during slavery, right? Where good slaves, as it were seen as obedient, docile, submissive, hardworking. Bad slaves, on the contrary, were the rebellious ones, and said to have faked illnesses, fled, practiced forms of subtle resistance. So this is a really ugly, but also really long form of prejudice that has persisted in this country. And unfortunately, today we're seeing it refracted through the lens of the New York City mayoral Democratic primary.
These good versus bad paradigms shape so much about how we've evaluated people in this country for a very long time. And once again, the spotlight is on Muslims. I sat down with Nathan and Tazeen to deconstruct this paradigm and to get to the bottom of why politicians are so eager to use sweeping generalizations as a political strategy. I think a lot of this pivots around how before, during, and now after New York City's mayoral Democratic primary, Israel and Gaza kept coming up. Do you think the framing of this issue and Mamdani's support for Palestinian human rights factors into some of the Islamophobia from lawmakers?
Absolutely. I mean, there's something so sadly poetic about the way that Mamdani's father's work on good Muslim, bad Muslim is providing the vocabulary to understand the rhetoric that's being deployed against Mamdani. So by all accounts, Mamdani fits into the category of a quote unquote bad Muslim. And that's in terms of his position on Palestine, showing solidarity with anti-imperial movements like Mamdani has done, categorizes him as this bad Muslim, right? It's the wrong kind of Muslim. And for any Muslim to be sort of politically active, what we've seen with Muslim politicians before him, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, is to be associated with some kind of radical politics. And so I think for some voters, including Muslim voters, Mamdani's position on Palestine is so refreshing, especially because he hasn't distanced himself from Palestinian solidarity, which stands out given the longstanding Palestine exception within progressive politics.
I mean, for more than 20 years, really longer than that, politicians have vilified native speakers of Arabic or Muslims who would invoke Arabic language, Arabic phrases, seizing upon this sense of foreignness by suggesting to American or European audiences that, for example, jihad means only holy war, or that Sharia refers to hand chopping or stoning, or that Allahu Akbar is some sort of rallying cry for terrorism, or that fatwa is a necessarily violent decree. And so we've seen this over and over again. And I think the larger truth in this political climate, like all political climates, is that words are given meaning through their contexts. You know, I think in some sense, to dovetail on Tazeen's point, you know, if Mamdani were to acquiesce to calls for him to denounce, globalize the Intifada, or to stray at all from the firm position that he's taken and this moral vision that he's articulated, he would be playing into the hands of the people who suggest that this phrase and attendant phrases are at their core something evil, something normatively violent. And I think that's simply a dishonest and immensely superficial way of viewing the world.
And yet some voters do feel threatened by those phrases. You know, I mean, something else I think that's important to bring up in this conversation is that, you know, public opinion about Israel and Gaza is shifting. There's been, you know, a long-standing military relationship between the United States and Israel. And I think for a very, very, very long time, it has been kind of the line for both political parties to unquestioningly support that relationship. But a Pew poll from March found that over half of Americans hold an unfavorable view of Israel, with almost 70% of Democrats saying so. That is a pretty big majority within the Democratic Party. A recent Quinnipiac College poll found that the percentage of Americans who say they side more with the Israelis is the lowest it's been since they started asking in 2001. Still, 37% to 32% who side with Palestinians, and 31% who say they don't know. How will this Islamophobia, some of which stems from Mamdani's views on Gaza, play with voters, though, who are cooling on Israel?
You know, there have undoubtedly been moments in American political history where anti-Semitism has festered to the fore. We know that. I think, though, for the most part, Jews are considered to be racially and culturally white. And that's not my assessment. It's based on Pew Research reporting, which as recently as 2021 showed data indicating that 92% of Jews living in the United States define themselves as white. And so I say that because there is this sense in which this group of people are cast as part of a dominant racial and cultural group in the United States. And I think that allows for the kinds of fragmentations that we see when it comes to Islamophobia, particularly in this context. I mean, I don't remember exactly what transpired during Michael Bloomberg's candidacy for New York City mayor, but he was the mayor for 11 years between 2002 and 2013. I don't recall people fearing the intrusion of halakha law or railing about the presence of kosher delis on every corner or posting images online showing the Statue of Liberty wearing a kippah. And I think the reality is that anyone today who sides with the plight of Palestinians or expresses basic sympathy or empathy for their position, including the children's YouTuber Miss Rachel, right, is going to be subjected to virulent hate. So while I think that, it might be true that data points to a changing landscape regarding Americans' views of Israel, I wonder if much of that is the result of ongoing attention to what is happening in Gaza today, rather than some sort of broad cultural shift writ large.
Drawing back to Nathan's point about Mamdani's unwillingness to condemn particular phrases like globalized intifada is so interesting because he's never himself used that phrase. I think what's really interesting to reflect on here is, with respect to Mamdani's candidacy, was really just how prominently his views on Israel-Palestine and foreign policy in general figured into coverage of the mayoral election. In debates and interviews, he was asked about it far more frequently than any other candidate, which points to the attention, how much attention was placed on his identity, right, and on Israel-Palestine. And I think that focus often missed the broader picture that most of his supporters backed him because of his vision for New York City. And I think the emphasis on his identity are also sort of doing this work of distracting from his platform and the idea that his policies are really appealing to New York City voters, and that's what they voted on.
The policies are appealing to New York City voters. And also, I should also note as a quick aside, those policies themselves also seem to be quite distressing to members of the Democratic establishment, as well as politicians who are on the right.
What's happening here is this sort of rejection of the outside group, a rejection of a group that doesn't, in the eyes of white Americans, belong, right? And, I can't help but think that the conversation that we're having about Mamdani is happening in a much broader political and social context, one in which Black Lives Matter artwork in public squares are being demolished, where African-American historical figures are being removed from national websites, DEI programs, right, at universities are under seizure and attack, foreign students being deported. So this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a much broader political environment and conversation that I think is, in a way, about who belongs and who doesn't. I think there is a way in which that has become almost ingrained in the way that we Americans do politics. Sad as it is to say that.
Coming up,
for the Democratic establishment, it's the progressive politics that are actually threatening. But if Islamophobia can help them sort of undermine these progressive politicians, then it helps them maintain that power.
stick around.
This message comes from Schwab. Everyone has moments when they could have done better, like cutting their own hair or forgetting sunscreen, so now you look like a tomato. Same goes for where you invest. Level up and invest smarter with Schwab. Get market insights, education, and human help when you need it. Learn more at schwab.com.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Delta, committed to the communities where their employees live, work, and serve. Delta First Officer Pilot Monique Grayson shares why she believes in the value of giving back.
Volunteering helps because it gives you an opportunity to see a different perspective. There's so much in the world that we'll miss. But when you take a moment to spend time with somebody else, to pour into somebody else, your perspective changes. You start to see the importance of being the change you want to see in the world. It helps people reach their goals when you have someone showing that they care. And when people feel cared for, they perform differently. Their confidence changes. This person is supporting me. And then not only that, it holds them accountable too. Because if the person that's supporting you is in a position where you want to be at, let me go ahead and put my best foot forward. At least that's how I would think about it.
Delta, committed to giving back for 100 years.
This message comes from REI Co-op, a Summit View, climbing El Cap, a faster mile, or that first 5K. It all starts here with gear, clothing, classes, and advice to get you there. so you can wave to your limits as you pass them by. Visit rei.com or your local REI co-op. Opt outside. This message comes from Ramp. Sally from finance loves fishing. She used to spend her weekends surrounded by receipts. Then she switched her company to Ramp. Now, spend is all under control, all in one place. Her team submits their expenses with a text, and she can close the books without all the busy work. So Sally's weekends are all her own, surrounded by fish, not receipts. Switch your business to Ramp.com and love finance again.
We've talked a lot about how this is very hurtful for some people. But who does Islamophobia benefit? And why would we see so many people willing to push, this Islamophobic narrative?
It benefits the people in power. And prejudice has always benefited people in power who want to stay in power and who know that staying in power means carving up the electorate, carving up a given population into various factions that can be pitted against each other, exploiting identities, marginalized groups for the purposes of stoking fear, which is a big part of Islamophobia. I think that's it. It's the powerful, it's the elite, it's the people that want to remain in control in a political sense, but also in a cultural sense, right? We've talked so much about politics, but politics can't really be siphoned off from a broader conversation about culture, about what it means to be an American, about what American identity is or what it should be, about who is included in that mix and who is excluded. So, I think in that sense, while, we've spent the last little bit talking specifically about Islamophobia, there's a thread that runs through Islamophobia that stitches it together with other forms of prejudice that have been at the heart of this republic for the duration of its existence, right? I mean, whether we go back to the very earliest days of our founding or the Barbary Wars that were fought some 10 or 12 years after America established its independence from Britain, right? We see these narratives over and over and over again, targeting different groups at different times, some pronounced, some less so, but always perpetrated by people in power that hope to retain that power.
Tazeen.
I mentioned earlier that Mamdani won on the basis of his platform. He appealed to voters based on his democratic socialist
really
policies.
popular policies.
Right. And these are the policies that are really threatening to the democratic establishment. For the democratic establishment, it's the progressive politics that are actually threatening. But if Islamophobia can help them sort of undermine these progressive politicians, then it helps them maintain that power. And that's always a trope that they can sort of rely on to shut down the actual progressive politics that would undermine the democratic establishment.
I got one last question. What does it mean for everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims, that these kind of attacks are still so viable?
Well, I think it means that we are not living up to the ideals that we think define this country. And I say think define this country because I've articulated, the myriad ways in which prejudice has run through our history for so long. We need to take a hard look at who we are as Americans and decide if, in fact, this is how we want to continue to live with one another. And, I don't want to end on a depressing note because I think it is true that while, we can focus on the Islamophobia of this, Mamdani won the election, right? And won in a city like New York that has been targeted with so much Islamophobia. I mean, maybe you remember the whole controversy regarding the so-called Ground Zero mosque, right? That was not a mosque and was not at Ground Zero. And the spell of anti-Muslim prejudice in the wake of 9/11, that someone could rise from that and secure the Democratic nomination for mayor and be a Muslim is hopeful. But yet at the same time, we're still dealing with it, right? And so I think we need to really decide who we want to be as a country, who we are as a country, and how each of us individually contribute to that.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think in real time we're experiencing a kind of changing tide where younger progressive voters are more educated in Islamophobia and more likely to see through it and call it out. And we're actually seeing a lot of reappropriation of the typical sort of dog whistle terminology. So all over social media, we're seeing people just reappropriating things like dog whistles, like they're saying hot caliphate summer or jihad against landlords. The only thing radical is my rent. And we didn't see this kind of pushback 2 decades ago in the early 2000s and in sort of Bush era Islamophobia or the first Trump era. Not to be overly optimistic, but I think that we are experiencing, particularly in the context of New York City voters, a kind of refusal to buy into those kinds of Islamophobic tropes. And I think more people, Muslim and non-Muslim, are calling that out.
Well, it seems we are really actually only at the very beginning of this race in so many ways. So there is quite some time, I guess, for us to continue to see how things with this develop. But I am so grateful that I got to have this conversation today with the two of you and kind of unpack what's happened so far. So Tazeen, Nathan, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was Tazeen Ali. She's a professor of religion and politics at Washington University, St. Louis, and Nathan Lean, a professor of religion at North Carolina State University. And I'm going to put on my influencer hat for a second and ask you to please subscribe to this show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening. Click follow so you know the latest in culture while it's still hot. This episode of It's Been a Minute was produced by
Liam McBain.
This episode was edited by
Nina Patak.
Our supervising producer is
Barton Girdwood.
Our executive producer is
Verilyn Williams.
Our VP of programming is
Yolanda Sanguini.
All right, that's all for this episode of It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Brittany Luce. Talk soon.
Support for NPR and the following message come from IXL Learning. IXL Learning uses advanced algorithms to give the right help to each kid, no matter the age or personality. Get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when you sign up today at IXL.com/NPR. This message comes from Homes.com. What kind of programs does this school have? How are the test scores? These are all things parents ask when they home shop. That's why each listing on Homes.com includes extensive reports on local schools. Homes.com. We've done your homework. This message comes from NPR sponsor Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where hundreds of researchers and clinicians make new discoveries inspired by the work of previous Dana-Farber scientists. See why nothing is as effective against cancer as a relentless succession of breakthroughs. Learn more about their momentum. Go to danafarber.org/everywhere.